The topic is historical and imaginative plays. A historical play or a history play is a dramatic work where the events of the plot are either partially or entirely drawn from history. It is also considered a theatrical genre. The characters in them are developed within a pattern based on historic facts but shaped by the author's imagination. A historical play recreates a single event on stage, synthesizing the facts it presents so that all scenes are unified in their relationship to one plot with a beginning, middle, and an end, embedding within this narrative an interpretation of the event. So it's called a historical play because it's basically based on a historical narrative that is often set in the medieval or early modern past. And it's called imaginative because the author's imagination is involved in it, and it also makes one question the historical accuracy of the play. For example, the history plays written by William Shakespeare, whose plays still serve to define the genre. So the best known examples of the genre are the history plays written by William Shakespeare. Defining the history play as a genre is a bit problematic because it is a narrative without a necessary course of action, without necessary character types, so it can be tethered to any genre: tragedy, comedy, romance, satire, etc. History play, describing a genre as opposed to the subject matter of a play, has imprecise origins and boundaries. When the editors of the 1623 folio edition divided Shakespeare's plays into comedies, tragedies, and histories, they already had some sense of the history play as a distinct dramatic type. But among the histories, they included Richard II and Richard III, which today we consider as tragedies. So it's a bit hard to define or to restrict the history play as some particular genre, be it tragedy, comedy, romance, or satire. And to make this confusing scenario a bit more clear, we can have a look at the examples of Shakespeare's plays given over here that we consider as tragedies, but the experts, the editors, considered them as the history plays or the historical plays. So here is a glimpse of the background of historical play so that you can have an idea how historical play itself evolved over time. Historical play is almost as old as theatre itself and continues to play a viable role in contemporary theatre. For the oldest surviving play, the Persians in 472 before Christ, Aeschylus drew on events from the Greco-Persian War in which he had fought 8 years earlier. Using historical characters and events, he imagined dialogue, compressed episodes for dramatic effect, and dramatized material to make points relevant to his contemporary audience, all strategies that remain part of the genre. In the Poetics, almost 140 years later, Aristotle advised that tragedies based on history increased an audience belief in the probability of event and thus heightened the emotional impact of the play. So here the strategies that you can see the author used, they are actually the features of a historical drama or a historical play. As he used historical character and events for the purpose of the main story or plot of the play, but he imagined the dialogues because obviously he wasn't there to note the dialogues down when the events actually happened. So he obviously had to imagine them. Then he compressed episodes for dramatic effect and dramatized material to make points relevant to his contemporary audience, because obviously you need to consider the kind of audience that you're writing the play for, or who is going to view the play as an audience. So you need to consider the audience as well while writing the play, and these are actually, they make up the basic features of the historical play. And this point explains that why later on the genre of tragedy was very much linked or connected to history play. That happened because tragedies get more popularity because it incites the emotions of empathy or sympathy in the viewer, and hence the viewer is able to connect to the play or the story in a better way, in an emotional manner. And similarly, it also enables the audience to believe in the factuality of the event, that the event actually happened sometime in the past for real. And that's how tragedy became connected to the history play. Following the Restoration, the English history as a genre lost much of the momentum that they had gained during the Tudor and Stuart eras. Even the most esteemed genre of English Renaissance theatre, tragedy, to which the history genre had been closely tied from the beginning, had fallen out of style in favor of tragi-comedy and comedy. Nevertheless, English playwrights produced numerous plays depicting historical events outside of England, including William Davenant's The Siege of Rhodes, John Dryden's The Indian Queen, and the Indian Emperor Elkanah's Settle's The Empress of Morocco. So here as some examples are mentioned, which shows that although the playwrights continued producing the plays which had some link to the historical events, but still the genre which was very much popular earlier, the tragedy, the genre of tragedy, it was actually replaced by the genre of tragi-comedy and comedy. And since tragedy was very much linked with the genre of history or historical play, so so the phasing out of tragedy shows that both the genres were actually replaced by the new, and the new genres that were prominent in that era, that were tragi-comedy and comedy. Interest in history plays revived in the early 19th century with the Romantic rejection of neoclassicism. Historical precedent was also enlisted to support emerging forces of nationalism, democracy, and spiritualism. Friedrich Schiller in Germany, Victor Hugo in France, and most of the important English Romantic poets wrote history plays, though of the later group, only Alfred Lord Tennyson's plays had any degree of commercial success. Historical authenticity became a new standard for elaborate stage spectacles throughout Europe and America, and even melodrama explored historical or pseudo-historical material. So in 19th century, history play as a genre actually got to bloom or flourish in its true sense. And even other genres like melodrama, as it is mentioned here, incorporated some elements of history play to make itself sound and seem more genuine. And the story that used to have some sort of historical event to depict, and the ones which were based on real life events were considered more real, since it's supposed to be closer to the reality. So even the genres like melodrama includes actually exaggerated characters and exciting events. So even such sort of genres included the elements of history or some sort of historical event in them to make them sound more genuine or more authentic. So in 19th century, playwrights were recreating the public lives of some prominent historical figures. But In 20th century, their focus shifted a bit toward their private life, and they tried to focus their private life instead of their public lives. Why? Because 20th century was all about realism. So the playwrights, having considered the importance of realism in 20th century, they tried to focus on the private life of some important historical figures, not the public life, which was already known to many of the people. After World War II, attitudes towards historical studies began to shift. A change eventually echoed in the structure of history plays. Traditional historical studies focused on political and military events, commonly from a Eurocentric perspective. Individuals, usually male representatives of the dominant culture, shaped events that led progressively to the ascendance of the hegemon. The first challenges came from Marxist historians who viewed history in terms of economic forces and class conflict. Later, a group of French historians known as the Analysts shifted attention away from dominant figures to social, cultural, and demographic processes. The deconstructionists, influenced by Jacques Derrida, called into question the efficacy of any meta-narrative of history and rejected the positivist confidence that historical data could be objectively discovered and reported. So after World War II, there was a huge shift in the attitude of the people, and the playwrights' works also started reflecting the particular school of thought they belonged to, as Marxists are known by their concern of the class conflict and the class divisions that were going on in the society at that time. So they were reflected in their work. And similarly, some of the French historians, they tried to shift the attention from the dominant figures who were some prominent historical figures. So they shifted the attention from them to social, cultural, and demographic processes. Similarly, the deconstructionists who were inspired and influenced by Derrida, they actually questioned the authenticity or the objectivity of the history that was being recreated by the playwrights or uh, by the playwrights in terms of the in regard to the plays that they wrote and that were being performed. Many contemporary historical dramas exploit the strategies of new history. In addition to Marxist histories, social histories dramatize group actions rather than those of individuals, and oppositional histories depict events from the outlook of the oppressed, the losers, or the disenfranchised. Feminist drama borrows from other historical approaches to reposition women and gender issues in the historical account. Conventional narratives are challenged by deconstructionist histories that use pastiche techniques and emphasize micro narratives. So, the basic strategies or the basic features of the historical play were actually manipulated or exploited in a way because, as here are a few examples are given that, as according to the oppositional histories, the history or the historical play was actually depicted from the perspective of the oppressed or the loser. Similarly, the social histories actually focused on the actions of a group of people instead of focusing it on some actions of the individuals. Similarly, the feminists actually focused on the gender issues that are there in the society or how the women are being marginalized in the society. So that was their focus. Similarly, deconstructionists, as they are more concerned with deconstructing everything, deconstructing the text or the narrative. So they focused more on the micro narratives instead of the meta narratives. Historical drama had always carried messages, but in contemporary theatre, history serves even more blatantly to sport specific agendas. Blatantly means obviously. So, as the history play always used to have some sort of message to convey, but the contemporary theatre actually conveyed some sort of contrasting social and political theories as mentioned in the previous slides. So the authors, the playwrights actually try to make their play sound or seem that it should have a message that can be clearly conveyed to the audience, and uh, and they actually did so. And here we have some examples. For example, Charles Ward's play Dingo used expressionist and music hall techniques to deconstruct World War II in North Africa from the viewpoint of common soldiers, a technique of social history. Some other examples: David Hare's Panchen is a Marxist microhistory recreating the collective process at work in a Chinese village. Carl Churchill combined social, Marxist, and feminist history in a number of plays. Light Shining in Buckinghamshire dramatizes the English Civil War in terms of the frustrated objectives of levelers, diggers, and ranters, with multiple actors playing a single character to de-emphasize the individual's role in shaping historical events. So you see how different playwrights incorporated different social or political theories to make their plays stand out. Let's have a look at some important and prominent playwrights who wrote historical and imaginative plays. Shakespeare is, although not one of the contemporary ones, but he is for sure an important one. The history play can almost be defined with reference to one man, for the history play is coextensive with Shakespeare's career. He begins his career with the chronicle plays in the Henry VI trilogy, 1592, making his name with the history play Richard the Third, 1593, exploring the art form in his second tetralogy, and returning to it at the end of his career after a long time away with Henry VIII. A consideration of the history play as a literary tradition is necessarily a consideration of the Elizabethan history play, and specifically the Shakespearean history play. The Shakespearean history play is mainly the history play of the Wars of the Roses, like what brought them about and how they came to an end. Maxwell Anderson, he wrote actually more than half a dozen historical dramas, but out of those, these three are the most popular ones, and also they were written in verse. Three of his most successful plays dealt with British queens: Elizabeth, the Queen Mary of Scotland, Anne of a Thousand Days. Then we have T.S. Eliot. The most successful verse dramatization of the period was T.S. Eliot's one historical play, Murder in the Cathedral, depicting the martyrdom of Thomas Becket. The play actually portrayed the assassination of Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral during the reign of Henry II in 1170. And for writing this play, Eliot drew on the writing of Edward Grimm, who was a clerk and an eyewitness to the event. Christopher also cast historical material into verse. His most successful play, Kurt Mantle, dealt as well with Becket, but focused more on King Henry II, who was also the subject of James Goldman's popular 1966 play The Lion Inventor. Kurt Mantle was actually the nickname of King Henry II, who was the main character of his play, James Goldman's. The Lion Inventor 1966 has been criticized as ahistorical. It tests the boundaries of the genre while also poking fun at its conventions. Although in many respects it has more in common with absurdist comic domestic drama, it retains an essentially historic core. The play was actually meant to depict the personal and political conflicts of Henry II of England and his wife, their children, and their guests during Christmas. And the play was actually mainly fictional. I mean, its historical accuracy was being questioned, and it was criticized because the dialogues or the action were not really considered historical or historically uh, factual. George Bernard Shaw's Saint John has received widespread praise and has even been compared favorably to Shakespeare's histories. The play is actually about a national heroine of France who at the age of 18 led the French army to victory over the English at Orleans, and she was captured a year later and then was burned. So after more than 500 years, she was officially declared as a Roman Catholic saint. The temporal boundary of history plays is tested in Stuff Happens by David Hare, which chronicles the events leading up to the Iraq War with only 2 years separating the author from his subject. The play focuses heavily on the use of exact quotes, with all public speeches given by the main characters being taken word for word from actual quotes. So the play was written in response to the Iraq War, and the author himself described it as a history play that deals with recent history. Then we have John Drinkwater. Abraham Lincoln was the most popular play of him. Then some other popular plays of him included Mary Stuart, Oliver Cromwell, Robert E. Lee. So the first one, Abraham Lincoln, was the most popular one. It made the author much popular, and the rest of the plays were also having a particular theme. In Mary Stuart, he gave a subtle study of a woman who cannot find anyone man great enough to satisfy her soul's love. And in Oliver Cromwell and Robert E. Lee, the author actually gave greater importance to the political and social problems than to the presentation of history. And the close association between the poetic school and historical school is well exemplified by this author and the next one, Clifford Bax. So Clifford Bax actually wrote several poetic plays, of which the most important ones are these: Socrates, Divination, The Immortal Lady, and The Rose Without the Thorn. They all are lyrical and philosophical plays, and the characters in them are developed within a pattern based on some historic facts, but the characters were actually shaped by the imagination of the author. Three of the important plays of Ashley Dukes are The Man with a Load of Mischief, The Fountainhead, and Eulenspiegel. Eulenspiegel. Lastly, Rudolf Besier. The Barretts of Wimpole Street is based on the romance between Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett, their elopement and marriage, and it was the most successful of all the historical plays produced in the 20th century. So the play portrayed how on September 12, 1846, while Barrett's family was away, she sneaked out of the house and met Browning at a church and they got married. Browning, who was actually a very popular poet and a playwright. So then the play showed and portrayed how she returned home for a week, keeping the marriage a secret, and then she fled with Browning to Italy. So the play was actually a success. These are the references.